Morning all, Brian S. Pratt here. Going to read chapter 21 of Fires of Prophecy, book 2 of the Warside Saga. So I just got back from my girlfriend's. Sorry for the hiatus, but some things are more important every once in a while. On a side note, we have about 9 more chapters or so, 9 more readings before we're done with Fires of Prophecy. Now, once I'm done with reading Fires of Prophecy, I'm going to hold off on it until I get Relic of the Ancients, book 4 of Travail of Dark Mage done. Once it's done, I'll resume with Warrior Priest. But until then, once I get Fires of Prophecy done, I'm gonna stop doing the morning reads because I need to start reading chapters a little bit more dedicated time to it towards reading chapters of relics, so that way I can get it done by the end of August. Takes time. And then I'm also hoping, if I can keep the momentum going, to do in August, published Relics of the Ancients, and then in September, do Tombs of the Necromancers, book 3 of Jacobs of the Adventurers Guild, and then in October, finish up the next Scar and Potbelly book. I'm thinking about calling that one there Saga of Thurlius Brownbottom. But yeah, that one there is about Scar and Potbelly's meeting, how they got their names and so forth. If you haven't read their first adventure, Ice Terraces at Crystal Craig, I think it's called. You don't have to. Those don't need to be read in order, because one has nothing to do with another. They're just the adventures that they talked about at the campfires. Although none of these adventures they talk about at the campfires so far. But we'll see what happens. Anyway, here's chapter 21. A little recap. They have escaped Azek. Everyone's after them now. They're no longer trying to pose as traitors. They have reached a town on the coast, and they have found a captain that's willing to take the bulk of their people back to Cardry, where they'll be safe. They just have to get to the ship in the morning. So they're spending the night at the inn, and then in the morning they're going to the ship. Now they've caught the attention of one of the eyes of the Empire. Like, I don't know, KGB, FBI, whatever. They're kind of nefarious, and they work to root out people who cause the Empire problems. And obviously James really has. Anyway, chapter 21. The night at the inn was one of the longest James could ever remember. Doing his best to sleep, he ended up tossing and turning all night as he worried about the next day. Sometime during the night, Jerome got up and headed to the door. "What are you doing?" James asked. Pausing in the dark, Jerome replied, "Down at the docks. I want to look around before morning." "Be careful," cautioned James, "and be back before sunup." "I will," he assured him. "Try to get some sleep." He then turned back toward the door and quickly made his way from the room. James listened to Jerome's soft tread down the hallway as he drifted back to sleep. Later in the evening, the shutting of the door startled him back awake when Jerome returned. "Just me," he heard Jerome say as he walked over to where James lay in bed. "We got trouble." "What?" "There are 20 or more guards stationed at the docks with more patrols on the streets than there were yesterday." "Did you find out why?" James asked. "No. It was all I could do just to avoid being seen." "How are we going to get the others to the crashing wave with guards everywhere?" "I don't know, but we better think of something fast," Jerome said. "Dawn's about an hour away." James sat there and contemplated the situation when Jerome said, "Maybe you and I could draw them off?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, we get the others close to the docks, then you and I go to another part of town and create a diversion." Nodding, James said, "That might work." "Can we get them close enough to the docks without being seen?" "I think so," Jerome replied. "Let's wake the others," he said, and as he got out of bed. Going to the other rooms, they soon had everyone awake and back in James's room for a quick meeting. They explained about the guards at the dock and what they planned to do. Selling the horses, Julie announced. That must have tipped them all off something was going on. Could have been, James agreed, but we had little choice. He made sure Roland had the 50 golds for their passage, then he took 10 apiece for Jerome himself. The rest they divided among everyone else. He turned to Roland and said, have Ezra keep Archie quiet. If he starts crying, it's all over. Hang on. There. I had rest twice. I had the rest they divided among the rest, and so I changed it to the remaining coins. They divided among everyone else. That sounds better. Okay. Roland nodded and communicated that to Ezra, who indicated she understood. All right, he said, let's go. They quietly made their way down to the main floor and left out the back near the stables. We should leave our horses here and get back to them when we're ready to leave town. If we are able, Jerome replied, we might be a little busy. Jerome took the lead and followed a roundabout way through the streets toward the docks. Twice they had to duck into side alleys when they encountered roving patrols. Both times they waited silently until they passed before continuing to the docks. When they were within sight of the docks, Jerome stopped before a door in the side of a darkened warehouse and placed his ear against it, listening. Then he turned the handle and opened the door as he motioned for everyone to file inside. The warehouse was empty, but for a few boxes that looked to have been abandoned. You should be able to wait here until you make the run for the ship. How will we know when it's time? Teresa asked. Jerome looked to James and said, I think you'll know. James nodded. Teresa gave her brother a hug. Be careful. He hugged her back and saw the tears in her eyes. Don't worry, I'll see you in Trindle. Trying to stop his own tears from falling, he said to James, we better get going. Good luck, Dilly said before they left. The others offered their goodbyes and see you laters as well. With a final look toward the pit fires, Jerome said, keep them safe. Scar said, you can count on us. The others nodded in agreement. With a slight nod, Jerome left the warehouse with James and closed the door behind him. Turning to James, he said, let's go, we'll cause some trouble. Right behind you, he said, not nearly as eager as Jerome seemed to be. Jerome led them through the back streets as they avoided patrols until they put most of the city between them and where the others waited. Hiding in the shadows of an alley, they watched a patrol of 5 guards approach from down the street. Are you ready? Jerome asked. No, James replied, sighing slightly, but I never will be. So let's just do it. They waited for the guards to march past, then Jerome ran out of the alley and tackled the one in the rear while James caused a light to burst overhead. His knives flashed, killing the rear guard, while James took out another with a slug. Shouts began sounding in the night and horns started to blare. Jerome quickly gained his feet as the remaining 3 turned around, momentarily blinded by the light bursting overhead. Jerome closed with the next one and quickly took him out. Let's get out of here, he yelled at James as they ran, leaving the remaining 2 guards to sound the alarm. Think that did it? James asked as they dashed through the side alley to get away from the scene of the attack. Probably not enough to draw them from the dock, he said. We need something big and more spectacular. We need something a bit more spectacular. All right, James said as they raced around the corner. Nothing yet, Shorty announced from where he looked out the window for the signal. It's only been a couple minutes, Dilly said. Give them time. Teresa came to Dilly and asked, do you think they will be able to draw away the guards at the docks? Dilly nodded as she remembered the massive explosion James had produced back at the City of Light. I'm sure they can manage it. Suddenly, a bright light flared through the window and everyone ran over to look. A starburst exploded in the sky near the far side of Alcur. Was that them? Asked Teresa. Had to be, Dilly replied. Just as horrid sounded in the distance. Shorty ran to a window that had a good view of the docks and the men stationed there. After a brief look, he turned back and said, they're still there. What are they doing? Scar asked as he moved to join them. They're looking at the light, but otherwise staying put. Come on, you guys, Dick said as he looked out the window toward the starburst that was beginning to fade. You've got to do better than that. Just 1 second, I gotta fix that. Just 1 second, almost done. There we go. They saw other guards running toward the commotion off in the distance, but the ones at the docks remained where they were. I don't think Jorn started to say when crump! A massive explosion ripped through the night, fireballs shot into the air, as well as chunks of stone from whatever had exploded. Way to go, James! Scar exclaimed jubilantly. Some are leaving, Shorty reported. How many? It looks like all but about 10, Scar replied. Potbelly said, that's better than 20. It's unlikely any more will leave if they haven't already, added Stig. I agree, Scar said. Shorty, can you take out a few before we get there? 3 or 4 replied. I'm running out of knives. That will do, he said. We can take care of the rest. Drawing one of the swords, Scar opened the door and took the lead as they made their way slowly toward the docks. The rest of the fighters followed closely behind, with Roland and the girls bringing up the rear with Potbelly, who was doing better, but still not up to his best. Remember, Potbelly got injured, got a crossbow bolt in his side as they were fleeing Azek, and he's been recovering ever since. But I'd still hate to face even a wounded Potbelly in a hand-to-hand fight. They watched as the first knife. When they reached the docks, they paused briefly before passing from the cover afforded by the last of the warehouses. Shorty readied his knives and, with a nod from Scar, threw them in rapid succession. The pit fighters broke into a run toward the guards as the second knife flew by. They watched as the first knife found its mark. As the man fell, the second hit the guard standing beside him. The rest of the guards became aware of the threat and scanned for the source of the flying knives. One of them shouted a warning when he spotted them running toward them, weapons out. A third knife took out another guard. Then Shorty's final knife hit the foremost guard in the shoulder. As he staggered from the blow, Scar reached him and quickly finished him off with a thrust through the middle. Potbelly stayed behind to guard the women and Roland, his sword and knife ready for any who somehow made it past the others. He kept an eye out behind them as well for any who might come from within Al-Qur. Stig faced off with the guard bearing a sword and shield. His mace smashed through the man's shield and snapped the bone of the arm holding it. He deflected the guard's sword with his shield while following through with his mace. Connecting with the man's helmet, he caved it in and crushed the skull beneath. As the guard fell lifelessly to the ground, he turned and engaged another. Shorty's fighting knives danced as he joined the fray, blocking the attacks of 2 guards. Unable to go on the offensive, he put up a good defense and kept them busy while the others dealt with the rest. Suddenly, a cry split the night, and Scar turned to see one of their own fall. A guard's sword wedged between his ribs. "Yorn!" he cried as he struck out at his opponents, severing the man's head from his shoulder. He ran to where Yorn lay and engaged the guard who had his foot on Yorn's chest, attempting to dislodge the sword. With the sword wedged in between Yorn's ribs, he was unable to defend himself and fell quickly to Scar's swords. Scar looked down to Yorn, but knew there was no hope when he saw his lifeless eyes. Having killed the opponent, Stig moved to help Shorty, who was still hard pressed by the 2 guards he faced. Coming up behind one, Stig bashed the mace in the base of the man's skull, practically removing the head from the neck. As the man dropped, Shorty was able to utilize both knives in his fight with the remaining guard, and soon had him on the ground next to his partner. Swearing at the loss of Yorn, Scar looked around and saw the rest of the guards lying dead on the docks. "Come on!" he yelled as he waited for Potbelly to bring the others. From across town, another massive explosion rocked the morning. They looked and saw a large fireball reach up and toward the sky. The morning was beginning to lighten as the sun peeked over the horizon. Scar looked to the ship, second from the end, and saw movement upon the rigging where the sailors prepared to get underway. Once Potbelly and the others joined them, they ran toward the crashing wave. Reaching the gangplank, Roland hollered up to the ship, "Permission to come aboard!" The captain came to the rail and looked down at them. Glancing over the dead guards lying on the docks, he replied, "Permission granted." "Come on," Roland said to the others as he crossed the gangway. When they were on board, they stopped abruptly as 4 crossbowmen emerged and took aim with their crossbows. From behind the captain stepped the Eye. "Thank you, Captain. You've been most helpful." James was tiring after such extended magic use. That last spell which took out the guardhouse had been particularly draining. "Do you think that's enough?" Grinning back at him, Jerome said, "That should be enough to get their attention in a bad way." They ran down a side alley as they attempted to evade another patrol passing through the area. They had been running and hiding since the last explosion, doing their best to avoid tangling with any large group of guards. James's supply of slugs was beginning to run low, only 10 left. "Maybe it's time to get the horses and leave," he suggested. Jerome nodded. "That would probably be a good idea. They should be on the ship by now." "I hope so," he said as he thought of Delia and especially little Archie. "Our horses are all the way across town," James informed him. "It's going to take us a while to get back there." "I know," he replied. "Lead on." Looking out into the alley, Jerome checked to make sure the streets were clear before exiting. They left the shadows and followed the street in the interest of speed. Breaking into a run, they made for the inn. Street by street, they made their way closer to the inn. Many times, they had to duck down alleys or into buildings to avoid being spotted. Back on the street after one such incident, they suddenly saw 6 soldiers turn onto the street ahead of them. Fortunately, they turned the other way, so failed to notice them. Soldiers? James asked as they quickly turned off the street into another alley. Not guards? Leading them deeper into the alley, Jerome replied, "Guess we really got their attention." "That was the plan," James said from behind. "Could be the ones who've been following us in the last few days." "Possibly," agreed James. Coming to the end of the alley, they paused as they watched a dozen or more riders run past on their way deeper into the city. They were just moving past this alley where James and Jerome hid, when from a window above them, a woman began crying out to the soldiers and pointing down to them. The soldiers paused, looked their way, then broke into a run. "Damn," Jerome cursed as they fled back down the alley. Before they reached the inn, Jerome grabbed James and ducked through a side door of the building opposite the one with the woman. Jerome slammed the door shut and locked it. They were in someone's home. He took the stairs up to the second floor, with James following close behind. Before they reached the top of the stairs, banging could be heard coming from the door leading to the alley. Emerging from the stairs onto the second floor, they came to a long hallway running the length of the home. From the far end, a door slammed shut and what sounded like furniture being piled against it to prevent them from getting access to the room. They did a quick search and located a narrow stairway leading to the roof. As Jerome stepped upon the ladder to go up to the roof, the door to the alley burst in. Moving quickly up the stairs, they reached the roof. Jerome paused momentarily as James cleared the ladder. "Where now?" James asked. He scanned the buildings adjacent to them and found one with a small enough gap between them that they would be able to jump. "Follow me," he said, then broke into a run and jumped over the gap between buildings. James ran as fast as he could and, with heart beating wildly, leapt. Sailing through the air, he glanced to the alley below and panicked. When he landed on the other side, he lost his balance, fell to the roof, and rolled a couple times before coming to a stop. Jerome was there to help him back to his feet, and then they ran to the opposite side, where they once more jumped the gap. James made it this time without falling. A noise behind them caused James to turn. Soldiers streamed onto the roof of the building they had originally exited. One more time, he heard Jerome say as he made for the edge of the building where he jumped across. Looking over his shoulder one last time before he started running for the edge, James saw the soldiers leap the first gap in pursuit. Bracing himself for another jump, he ran quickly and soared over to the building, where he landed well, maintaining his balance. Jerome stood by an open trapdoor and led down into the building. "Hurry!" he yelled as he climbed down. James reached the trapdoor, and started down when he heard Jerome fighting with someone on the inside. When he cleared the top, he saw him battling with a man in his nightshirt. In a nightshirt. The man was no match for Jerome and was soon lying on the floor of the hallway, blood soaking the front of his nightshirt. "Did you have to kill him?" James asked as Jerome turned and headed to the stairs. With impatience in his voice, Jerome replied, "Didn't have time not to." Coming to the front door, he paused a moment. I think we're only a couple of streets from the inn." "Thank goodness!" exclaimed James. He looked out the window near the door and saw many soldiers running past on their way to the building they had originally entered down the street. Suddenly, they heard the pounding of feet on the roof as the soldiers chasing them arrived from the other building, from the adjacent building. Jerome said to James, "There are still a lot of soldiers out there." "What choice do we have?" he replied grimly. Jerome threw open the door and quickly engaged the closest soldier, taking him by surprise. At the clash of metal, every eye turned toward them. Jerome quickly disposed of the soldier as he turned to face the others. James paused momentarily as he gazed at the dozens of soldiers in the street that were now intent upon them. Crumph! The ground exploded to the right, throwing soldiers and dirt into the air. Then he released the power again as the ground to their left erupted. 2 soldiers were left dazed and staggering after the explosions. Jerome closed with the first. In his dazed state, the man was unable to defend himself. Jerome took him out in short order. The other soldier gained his senses quickly and drew his sword as he advanced. James looked back to the building they had just vacated and saw the soldiers coming down the stairs from the roof, headed for the open door. Almost out of reflex, he unleashed a blast of energy through the door, knocking them backward and shoving them down, and slowing them down. "Come on," Jerome said as the second soldier fell. His head bursting with pain and knees wobbly, James hurried as best he could. Jerome saw the condition he was in and put James's arm around his neck, helping him toward the inn. They moved along the path left between the two large holes in the road created by explosions and moved into another alley on the far side. Hurrying as best they could, they reached the rear wall of the inn's courtyard. The courtyard was crowded with people who screamed and fled when they saw Jerome and James approaching. Jerome was a ghastly sight, covered in blood with one knife drawn, glinting in the torchlight. The courtyard soon cleared of the panicked people. They moved to the stable to retrieve their horses that they had left saddled for a quick escape. Once in the saddle, they rode out of the courtyard and into the street where Jerome plowed through a group of soldiers, knocking them to the ground. Riding with all speed, they raced for the edge of town. Several crossbow bolts flew in their direction, but all missed their marks. They galloped with reckless abandon, heedless of anyone in their way as they rode for the edge of town. Suddenly, Jerome pulled up and came to a halt. "Why did you stop?" James hollered as he slowed. James pointed down the street. "Look." Turning to where Jerome pointed, he gasped when he saw a man stationed along the road ahead of them. There were easily 30 crossbowmen and another 250 of foot soldiers barring their way. "Oh man," he said. Beyond the waiting man was the edge of town and escape. Looking behind them, Jerome saw a swarm of soldiers headed their way. "Looks like we're trapped." "Jerome," James said. "Yes," he replied without taking his eyes off the approaching soldiers. James removed a rope from behind the saddle and tied himself in place. "You may need to lead my horse should I lose consciousness." Jerome looked at him. "What do you plan?" "Don't have time to explain," he replied. "Just don't let go of my horse, whatever you do." Jerome nodded and took the reins as James closed his eyes. Behind them, the soldiers were fast approaching. Only 5 buildings separated them from where they sat on their horses. The soldiers barring the edge of town took notice of them as well and had begun a slow advance. "Come on, James," he thought as he watched the men drew closer. All of a sudden, 2 of the buildings behind them blasted apart, their stones raining down upon the men running in the street. Cries rang out as stones crushed the men. With great relief, Jerome saw the street behind them was now completely blocked by the rubble. He looked at James and saw perspiration form and trickle down his face. His breathing came in gasps, and he lay slightly in the saddle. "James?" he asked, but then stopped when James shook his head. "Leave me be," James said. The wind abruptly picked up as it steadily increased in intensity. Jerome looked to the sky as clouds appeared, moving toward them from all directions with unnatural speed. James groaned with the effort, but still he concentrated, directing the magic. Having just witnessed the power James unleashed on the men now dead under the rubble, the soldiers at the edge of town became restless. They grew even more so when the clouds gathered threateningly in the sky above them. Several crossbow bolts flew in their direction, but the force of the wind knocked them awry. A man with a commanding presence, an officer by his bearing, stood there yelling at the nervous soldiers, attempting to bolster their courage. Jerome looked on in absolute amazement as he watched a section of the clouds descend a little ways down from the dark mass above, and then suddenly, with great speed, it slammed into the waiting men below. Nothing could be heard but the roar of the tornado as it ripped through the gathered men beneath it. Bodies were ejected, flying in all directions to land broken and lifeless. Those not directly under it were sucked into it until they too were eventually thrown out to not move again. A very few men survived the initial plunge of the tornado. Thrown around by the wind, they fled for their very lives. Suddenly, a cry from James, and the tornado split in two, each half moving away from the center in opposite directions. Jerome glanced back to James, who tried to say something but was having difficulty being heard over the roar of the wind. Leaning closer, Jerome made out, "Now, go between them." Trusting in James, he got the horses moving quickly, and they approached the towering funnels. The wind whipped them mercilessly as he approached the gap between the two. The horses balked at going between them, but with whips and kicks, Jerome forced them through. "Hurry!" he barely heard James shout as they passed between the swirling masses of destruction. Kicking the horses harder, Jerome at last emerged from the other side, where it took little encouragement to get the horses into a gallop. Another cry escaped James before he passed into consciousness. Jerome looked back to the tornadoes and saw them melding back together into one large vortex that quickly dissipated. Seeing no pursuit developing, he turned the horses southeast and raced out into the desert. "Please, drop your weapons," the ice said. "We're back on the ship now." Roland glared at the captain, feeling betrayed. The captain just returned his stare, his face devoid of any emotions. The eye raised his hands, and the crossbow took aim. As he repeated his command, "Drop your weapons, now!" With little choice, they removed their weapons and dropped them to the deck. "You've given us quite a chase," he said. "Fortunately, that is now over." Turning to the captain, the eye said, "Have your men secure their hands behind them." captain glanced behind him to his men standing there. "You heard him, boys." "Aye, Captain," said one, as they started to move toward Roland and the rest. As they passed through where the crossbowmen stood, they suddenly turned and knocked the crossbows out of their hands, quickly subduing them. The captain, in a fluid motion, drew a sword and placed a point on the eye's chest. "What is the meaning of this?" the eye exclaimed in anger when he saw the captain's sword threatening him. "You're not taking them," he informed the eye. "I'll have you killed for this, Captain," the eye warned vehemently. "I'll send your ship to the bottom of the sea. Toss them over, lads." The captain told his crew, ignoring the threats of the eye. One by one, the crossbowmen were hurled overboard until only the eye remained. "Captain!" One of the men up in the rigging hollered as he pointed toward the docks. "We've got company." The captain looked over to the docks and saw a score of men running toward his ship. "You'll never get out of this harbor alive," the eye warned. "Cast off," he shouted to his men, who began casting off lines and climbing the rigging. "Your death will be a pleasure," the eye continued, watching as you wriggle upon the end of a pole as it slowly pushes its way through your guts from your ass. "Would you just shut up?" the captain yelled. He turned him around, booted him in the butt, and watched as he sailed over the rail into the sea below. "Thank you, Captain," Teresa said as she came forward. Enough time for that later," he told her. "You and the others stay out of our way, and we may yet live through this." "Mr. Kearney," he hollered. "Yes, sir," a sailor yelled from the other side of the ship. "Make for deep water." "Aye, aye, Captain," he replied as he began turning the wheel to steer them out to sea. The wind filled their sails as they slowly turned away from the docks and headed out of the harbor. Splash! A rock struck the water not 5 feet from the side of the ship. "Look!" Stig cried as another boulder flew through the air toward him. They braced for impact, but it overshot and splashed harmlessly 20 feet away. "That was close," he exclaimed shortly. "Yes, Mr. Kearney," the captain yelled. "Yes, Captain," Mr. Kearney replied. "Hard to port. Evasive actions." "Aye, aye, Captain." And then they felt the ship lurch as Mr. Kearney attempted to evade the oncoming boulders. "Captain, look!" Dilly cried as she saw 2 ships pulling away from the docks. "I see 'em, lass," the captain told her. "If we can beat them to open water, they'll never catch us." "Ahoy aloft, full sails!" he shouted to those in the rigging. Without even a reply, they completely unfurled the sails. Once they were fully extended, the boat lurched forward as the wind took hold. Thea looked back to the ships in pursuit, but they had already begun to fall behind. She soon realized that they were not going to be able to catch them. The captain came to where they crouched by the railing and asked, "So, do you have my 50 gold pieces?" She nodded to Roland, who handed over the pouch containing the gold. The captain opened it and looked through it, satisfied. "You did all this for 50 golds?" Stig asked incredulously. "No, son," the captain replied. "I did it because I hate the Empire." "But you risked your life and your ship for us," Dilly said. "How can we ever repay you?" Having the pleasure of kicking that son of a sea cow overboard was payment enough, he told her, breaking into a big smile. Make yourself comfortable. It's a 3-day trip to Cardry." The wind started to fall off suddenly, and there was a cry from up above. The captain looked to the sky and watched in amazement as clouds flowed unnaturally toward Alcur. "What the hell?" he exclaimed. "It's James," Julia whispered to the others. "You think so?" "Has to be. Only magic can make the clouds react like that." They looked back to Alcur and watched as the clouds intensified over the town and then suddenly descended to the ground in one spot. After a couple of minutes, the clouds dissipated and everything returned to normal. "Hope they're all right," Teresa said, worried for her brother. "Those 2 can take care of themselves," Scar assured her. "I hope so," she said as she watched Alcur slowly disappear in the distance. "I hope so." So there ends chapter 22. I enjoyed writing that chapter. And I thought about drawing out the whole eye thing on the ship, but it's very satisfying having the captain to say, "Shut up," and kick him off the side as he's sitting there spouting condemnations and threats. And I don't think people care for that too much. So booted him over the side, kicked him. Probably should have killed him, but they didn't. Anyway, they're now headed to Cardry. And like I said in the previous video, the whole reason I did that was simply because I get down to James and Jerome. It's a lot easier to write 2 people than a whole crowd. Because the whole crowd, you have to mention everybody every once in a while. And that just gets tedious after a while, so I just get rid of everybody. Like in Relic of the Ancients, book 4 of Travail, I got a lot of moving parts in it. But there's not a large group of the moving parts. There's like small groups of moving. So that's still easier. But this might be my last really big moving part, but I'm hoping. I don't think the next one will be. The finale, the 5th book of Travail, I think it's going to be more linear. and just following one group of people. I think. Never know. I have a good idea of what I'm going to do with number 4 or number 5. Don't have title for it yet, obviously. But yeah, I have a good idea, but I can't really define details until I see how this is going to end. I have an idea how it's going to end, but like Mrs. Sorrows, right? I had this idea for an end, and I had like, I went from point A to like say point H, right? And then this one here was supposed to be I, but then I got another. But then I got I, and I became J, and I kept adding and adding and adding things. But I like that book. So, chapter 22 tomorrow. I'm back on schedule. I'll do one a day now until I've done them all, and then, like I said before, I'm gonna take a break. That way, instead of reading these chapters in the morning, I can read Relic of the Ancient chapters, so I get that book done faster. I'm feeling really good about writing right now. I haven't felt this good about writing in a long time. A lot of things are really falling into place well for me right now. I'm in a good place. So I'll see you tomorrow.